Why does the career of Napoleon Bonaparte continue to fascinate? And how did Napoleon both preserve and undermine the ideals of the French Revolution? Lastly, how did Napoleon speed up the modernization of Europe? The upheavals of the French Revolution made possible the extraordinary career of Napoleon Bonaparte. This popular general, who gained control over France in 1799, combined a passion for power with a genius for leadership. Under Napoleon's military dictatorship, the constitutional government for which the people of 1789 had fought and the republican democracy for which the Jacobins had rallied the nation seemed lost. Nevertheless, during the Napoleonic era, many achievements of the revolution were preserved, strengthened, and carried to other lands. Napoleon Bonaparte, the son of a petty noble, was born on August 15, 1769, on the French-ruled island of Corsica. After finishing military school in France, he became an artillery officer. The wars of the French Revolution gave him an opportunity to advance his career. In December 1793, Napoleon's brilliant handling of artillery forced the British to lift their siege of the city of Toulon. 2 years later, he saved the Thermidorian Convention from a royalist insurrection by ordering his troops to fire into the riotous mob, the famous whiff of grape shot. In 1796, he was given command of the French army of Italy. His star was rising.
In Italy, against the Austrians, Napoleon demonstrated a dazzling talent for military planning and leadership, which earned him an instant reputation. Having tasted glory, he could never do without it. Because he had experienced only success, nothing seemed impossible. He sensed that he was headed for greatness. Years later, he recalled, "In Italy, I realized I was a superior being and conceived the ambition of performing great things, which hitherto had filled my thoughts only as a fantastic dream."
How did Napoleon Bonaparte rise to power? In 1796 to 1797, Napoleon conquered most of northern Italy for France, and had developed a taste for governing. In northern Italy, he moved to suppress religious orders, end serfdom, and limit age-old noble privilege. In 1798, Napoleon was defeated by a British navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson, who destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Abandoning his troops in Egypt, Napoleon returned to France and received a hero's welcome. Although the Egyptian expedition was a failure, Napoleon, always seeking to improve his image, sent home glowing bulletins about French victories. To people in France, he was the conqueror of Egypt, as well as of Italy. Meanwhile, political unrest, financial disorder, and military reversals produced an atmosphere of crisis in France. Napoleon knew that in such times people seek out a savior. A man of destiny must act. Without informing his men, he slipped out of Egypt, avoided British cruisers, and landed in France in October 1799. When Napoleon arrived in France, a conspiracy was already underway against the government of the Directory. Convinced that only firm leadership could solve France's problems, some politicians plotted to seize power and establish a strong executive. Needing the assistance of a popular general, they turned to Napoleon, whom they thought they could control. Although the hastily prepared coup d'état was almost bungled, the government of the Directory was overthrown. The French Revolution entered a new stage, that of military dictatorship.
With the government in disarray, Napoleon launched a successful coup d'état on November 9, 1799. He proclaimed himself first consul, Julius Caesar's title, and did away with the elected assembly, appointing a senate instead. In 1802, he made himself sole consul for life. 2 years later he proclaimed himself emperor.
The new constitution, 1799, created a strong executive. Although 3 consuls shared the executive office, the first consul, Napoleon, monopolized power. Whereas Napoleon's fellow conspirators, who were political moderates, sought only to strengthen the executive, Napoleon aspired to personal rule. He captured the reins of power after the coup, and his authority continued to expand.
In 1802, he was made first consul for life, with the right to name his successor. And on December 2, 1804, in a magnificent ceremony at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. General, first consul, and then emperor, it was a breathless climb to the heights of power. Napoleon, who once said that he loved
power as a musician loves his violin, was determined never to lose it.
Napoleon wanted to heal the divisions within the Catholic Church that had developed after the confiscation of church property and the civil constitution of the clergy. But, Napoleon's clear intent was to use the clergy to prop up his regime. Catholicism was declared the religion of the majority of Frenchmen. Papal acceptance of church lands lost during the Revolution. Bishops subservient to the regime. 3. Eventually, Pope Pius VII renounced the Concordat, and Napoleon had him brought to France and placed under house arrest. In effect, the Concordat guaranteed the reforms of the Revolution. The Church did not regain its confiscated lands or its right to collect the tithe. The French clergy remained largely subject to state control. And by not establishing Catholicism as the state religion, the Concordat did not jeopardize the newly won toleration of Jews and Protestants. Napoleon had achieved his aim. The Concordat made his regime acceptable to Catholics and to owners of former church lands. Napoleonic reforms. While Napoleonic rule is often taken to signify the end of the French Revolution, it should not be overlooked that Napoleon instituted several sweeping reforms, both in France and in the lands he was to conquer.
First, the Napoleonic Code, codifying and standardizing laws in much of Europe and contributing to ending feudalism in many areas. Second, general implementation of the doctrine of careers open to talent, using the ablest men irrespective of background and past loyalties. Third, he also introduced rational measures and practices in administration of the empire, supported the sciences and expanded the scope of education. Fourth, perhaps most importantly, however, he brought the order and stability and sense of unity that the French had been seeking for so many years.
Code of Napoleon of 1804. It divides civil law into personal status, property, the acquisition of property. Its purpose was to reform the French legal code to reflect the principles of the Father Revolution. Create one law code for France. Wherever it was implemented in the conquered territories, the Code Napoleon swept away feudal property relations. Napoleon's educational policy was an elaboration of the school reforms initiated during the Revolution. Like the revolutionaries, Napoleon favored a system of public education, with a secular curriculum and minimal church involvement. For Napoleon, education served a dual purpose. It would provide him with capable officials to administer his laws and trained officers to lead his armies, and it would indoctrinate the young in obedience and loyalty.
He established the University of France, a giant board of education that placed education under state control. To this day, the French school system, unlike that in the United States, is strictly centralized, with curriculum and standards set for the entire country.
In 1791, in the midst of the French Revolution, black slaves on Santo Domingo, the rich French sugar colony in the West Indies, revolted, murdering their masters, burning down plantations, and crying, "Vengeance! Vengeance!" Their hatred of servitude, which had ignited slave revolts in previous decades, was intensified by the ideals of liberty and equality reverberating across the Atlantic.
François-Dominique Toussaint Louverture, c. 1743–1803, joined the rebellion and quickly rose to a position of command. Toussaint was the son of a petty African chief from Dahomey, who, like millions of other Africans, had been captured in war, sold to Westerners, and brought in chains to toil on plantations in the New World. Toussaint, the eldest of 8 children, was born in captivity. A remarkable old black taught him French and some Latin and geometry, and his master, recognizing Toussaint's ability, made him first a coachman and then steward of the plantation's livestock, a position almost never held by a non-white.
In 1801, 2 years after seizing power in France, Napoleon sent 20,000 troops to Santo Domingo to restore slavery and to subdue Toussaint, whose power had increased considerably. The old warrior, having lost none of his skills in guerrilla warfare, was at the point of defeating the French when he proposed peace. The French commander tricked Toussaint into believing that if he retired, France would negotiate a favorable settlement with Santo Domingo. Shortly after he retired to his farm, Toussaint was arrested and sent to prison in France, where he suffered abuse and humiliation until his death in 1803. On January 1, 1804, revolutionaries on the island established the independent state of Haiti, whose foundation Toussaint Louverture had laid.
The coronation of Napoleon as Emperor of the French took place on Sunday, December 2, 1804 Frimaire, year 13 according to the French Republican calendar at Notre Dame de Paris in Paris. It marked the instantiation of modern empire, and was a transparently masterminded piece of modern propaganda.
To this end, he designed a new coronation ceremony unlike that for the kings of France, which had emphasized the king's consecration and anointment and was conferred by the Archbishop of Reims in Reims Cathedral. Napoleon's was a sacred ceremony held in the Great Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris in the presence of Pope Pius VII. Napoleon brought together various rites and customs, incorporating ceremonies of Carolingian tradition, the ancient regime and the French Revolution, all presented in sumptuous luxury.
The curule seat that was part of a set made for the reception of Napoleon by the corps legislative after his coronation as emperor. Made in the workshop of Jacob Desmalter, designed by Bernard Poyet in 1805. Napoleon wanted to establish the legitimacy of his imperial reign, with its new dynasty and new nobility. By 1810, Napoleon dominated continental Europe, except for the Balkan Peninsula. The Grand Empire comprised lands annexed to France, vassal states, and cowed allies. The French Republic had already annexed Belgium and the German left bank of the Rhine. Napoleon incorporated several other areas into France, German coastal regions as far as the western Baltic and large areas of Italy, including Rome, Geneva and its environs, Trieste, and the Dalmatian coast. Vassal states in the Grand Empire included 5 kingdoms ruled by Napoleon's relatives, 2 kingdoms in Italy and the kingdoms of Holland, Westphalia, and Spain.
Besides the 5 satellite kingdoms, there were several other vassal states within the Grand Empire. Napoleon formed the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806. Its members, a loose association of 16, later 18, German states, were subservient to the emperor, as were the 19 cantons of the Swiss Confederation. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw, formed in 1807 from Prussia's Polish lands, was placed under the rule of the German King of Saxony, one of Napoleon's vassals. Finally, the Grand Empire included states compelled to be French allies: Austria, Prussia, Russia, Sweden, and Denmark.
With varying degrees of determination and success, Napoleon extended the reforms of the Revolution to other lands. His officials instituted the Code Napoléon, organized an effective civil service, opened careers to talent, and equalized the tax burden. Besides abolishing serfdom, manorial payments, and the courts of the nobility, they did away with clerical courts, promoted freedom of religion, permitted civil marriage, pressed for civil rights for Jews, and fought clerical interference in secular matters. They also abolished guilds, introduced a uniform system of weights and measures, eliminated internal tolls, and built roads, bridges, and canals.
They promoted secular education and improved public health. Napoleon had launched a Europe-wide social revolution that attacked the privileges of the aristocracy and the clergy and hastened the modernization of 19th-century Europe. Napoleon had a twofold purpose in implementing these reforms: promoting administrative efficiency and winning the support of conquered peoples. Pleased by the overhaul of feudal practices and the reduction of clerical power, many Europeans, particularly the progressive bourgeoisie, welcomed Napoleon as a liberator. But there was another side to Napoleon's rule. The tyrant of Europe turned conquered lands into satellite kingdoms and exploited them for the benefit of France. In a letter to Prince Eugene, Viceroy of Italy, Napoleon revealed his policy.
Although Napoleon's domestic policies gained him wide support, it was his victories on the battlefield that mesmerized the French people and gratified their national vanity. Ultimately, his popularity and his power rested on the sword. In 1802, he declared,
"My power proceeds from my reputation, and my reputation from the victories I have won." My power would fail if I were not to support it with more glory and more victories. Conquest has made me what I am.
Only conquest can Napoleon, the Corsican adventurer, realized Louis Xiv's dream of French mastery of Europe. Between 1805 and 1807, Napoleon decisively defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia, becoming the virtual ruler of Europe. In these campaigns, as in his earlier successes in Italy, Napoleon demonstrated his greatness as a military commander.
The continental system of Napoleon Bonaparte.
The goal is to isolate Britain and promote Napoleon's mastery over Europe. The Berlin Decrees 1806, British ships were not allowed in European ports. Order in Council, 1806, Britain proclaimed any ship stopping in Britain would be seized when it entered the continent. Milan Decree 1807, Napoleon proclaimed any ship stopping in Britain would be seized when it entered the continent. These edicts eventually led to the United States declaring war on Britain. War of 1812.
The Napoleonic Wars 1803 to 1815 were a series of major conflicts pitting the French Empire and its allies, led by Napoleon I, against a fluctuating array of European powers formed into various coalitions, financed and led by the United Kingdom. It produced a brief period of French domination over most of Europe. The wars stemmed from the unresolved disputes associated with the French Revolution and its resultant conflict. The wars are often categorized into 5 conflicts, each termed after the coalition that fought Napoleon: the Third Coalition 1805, the Fourth 1806–07, the Fifth 1809, the Sixth 1813–14, and the Seventh 1815. The goal of these wars was to establish a stable government in France while showing Europe the army they had amassed for protection. Aside from the hostility of subject nationals, Napoleon had to cope with the determined opposition of Great Britain. Its subsidies and encouragement kept resistance to the emperor alive. But perhaps Napoleon's greatest obstacle was his own boundless ambition, which warped his judgment. From its peak, the emperor's career soon slid downhill to defeat, dethronement, and deportation.
Napoleon's failure to subdue England. Britain was Napoleon's most resolute opponent. It could not be otherwise, for any power that dominated the continent could organize sufficient naval might to threaten British commerce, challenge its sea power, and invade the island kingdom. Britain would not make peace with any state that sought European hegemony, and Napoleon's ambition would settle for nothing less.
Because he could not make peace with Britain, Napoleon resolved to crush it. Between 1803 and 1805, he assembled an invasion flotilla in the English Channel. But there could be no invasion of Britain while British warships commanded the channel. Unable to conquer Britain by arms, Napoleon decided to bring what he called the nation of shopkeepers to its knees by damaging the British economy. His plan, called the Continental System, was to bar all countries under France's control from buying British goods. Though hurt, Britain escaped economic ruin by smuggling goods onto the continent and increasing trade with the New World. But the Continental System also punished European lands dependent on British imports. Hundreds of ships lay idle in European ports, and industries closed down. In 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar demonstrated British naval power when Admiral Nelson devastated a combined French and Spanish fleet. Napoleon was forced to postpone his invasion scheme indefinitely.
Napoleon defeated the Third Coalition. The German War of Liberation. Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign helped trigger uprisings in the German states. Hatred of the French invaders had evoked a feeling of national outrage among some Germans, who up to this time had thought only in terms of their own particular state and prince. Some German intellectuals, using the emotional language of nationalism, called for a war of liberation against Napoleon and, in some instances, for the creation of a unified Germany. Besides arousing a desire for national independence and unity, the defeat of the Prussians at Jena 1806, and French domination of Germany stimulated a movement for reform among members of the Prussian high bureaucracy and officer corps. To survive in a world altered by the French Revolution, Prussia would have to learn the principal lessons of the Revolution, that aroused citizens fighting for a cause make better soldiers than mercenaries and oppressed serfs, and that officers selected for daring and intelligence command better than nobles possessing only a gilded birthright. The reformers believed that the elimination of social abuses would overcome defeatism and apathy and encourage Prussians to serve the state willingly and to fight bravely for national honor. A revitalized Prussia could then deal with the French. Among the important reforms introduced in Prussia between 1807 and 1813 were the abolition of serfdom, the granting to towns of a large mesure of self-administration, the awarding of army commissions on the basis of merit instead of birth, the elimination of cruel punishment in the ranks, and the establishment of national conscription. In 1813, the Reform Party forced King Frederick William III to declare war on France. The military reforms did improve the quality of the Prussian army. In the War of Liberation 1813, Prussian soldiers demonstrated far more enthusiasm and patriotism than they had at Jena in 1806, and the French were driven from Germany. An ally of France since 1796, Spain proved a disappointment to Napoleon. It failed to prevent the Portuguese from trading with Britain and contributed little military or financial aid to France's war effort. Napoleon decided to incorporate Spain into his empire. In 1808, he deposed the Spanish ruler and designated his brother Joseph as King of Spain. Napoleon believed that the Spanish would rally round the gentle Joseph and welcome his liberal reforms. This confidence was a fatal illusion. Spanish nobles and clergy feared French liberalism. The overwhelmingly peasant population, fanatically religious and easily stirred up by the clergy, viewed Napoleon as the devil's agent. Loyal to the Spanish monarchy and faithful to the church, the Spanish fought a war to the knife against the invaders.
Both sides in the Peninsular War displayed extreme cruelty. Guerrilla bands, aided and encouraged by priests preaching holy war, congregated in mountain hideouts. Striking from ambush, they raided French convoys and outposts. The war waged by Spanish partisans foreshadowed a 20th-century phenomenon, the inability of a great power, using trained soldiers and modern weapons, to subdue peasant guerrillas. Napoleon tricked the Spanish king and prince to come to France, where he imprisoned them. He proclaimed his brother, Joseph, to be the new king of Spain. He stationed over 100,000 FR troops in Madrid. On May 2, 1808, Dos de Mayo, the Spanish rose up in rebellion. FR troops fired on the crowd in Madrid the next day, 3 de Mayo.
Napoleon now poured 500,000 troops into Spain over the next few years. But, the FR generals still had trouble subduing the Spanish population. The British viewed this uprising as an opportunity to weaken Napoleon. They moved an army into Portugal to protect that country and to aid the Spanish guerrillas. After 5 long years of savage fighting, FR troops were finally pushed back across the Pyrenees Mountains out of Spain. The expanse of Napoleon's empire. Disaster in Russia, General Winter. The unsuccessful invasion of Russia in 1812 diminished Napoleon's glory and hastened the collapse of his empire. Deteriorating relations between Russia and France led Napoleon to his fatal decision to attack the Eastern Giant. Unwilling to permit Russia to become a Mediterranean power, the emperor resisted the Tsar's attempts to acquire Constantinople. Napoleon's creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw irritated the Tsar, who feared a revival of Polish power and resented French influence on Russia's border. Another source of friction between the Tsar and Napoleon was Russia's illicit trade with Britain in violation of the continental system. Napoleon reasoned that if he permitted the Tsar to violate the trade regulations, other lands would soon follow, and England would never be subdued. No doubt Napoleon's inexhaustible craving for power also compelled him to strike at Russia.
Napoleon assembled one of the largest armies in history. Some 614,000 men, 200,000 animals, and 20,000 vehicles. Frenchmen constituted about half of the Grande Armée de la Russie. The other soldiers, many serving under compulsion, were drawn from a score of nationalities. The emperor intended to deal the Russians a crushing blow, forcing Tsar Alexander I to sue for peace. But the Russians had other plans: to avoid pitched battles, retreat eastward, and refuse to make peace with the invader. Napoleon would be drawn ever deeper into Russia in pursuit of the enemy.
In June 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Neman River into Russia. Fighting only rear-guard battles and retreating, the Tsar's forces lured the invaders into the vastness of Russia, far from their lines of supply. In September, the Russians made a stand at Borodino, some 70 miles west of Moscow. Although the French won, opening the road to Moscow, they lost 40,000 men and failed to destroy the Russian army, which withdrew in order. Napoleon still did not have the decisive victory with which he hoped to compel the Tsar to make peace. At midnight on September 14, the Grand Army, its numbers greatly reduced by disease, hunger, exhaustion, desertion, and battle, entered Moscow. Expecting to be greeted by a deputation of nobles, Napoleon found instead that the Muscovites had virtually evacuated their holy city. To show their contempt for the French conquerors and to deny the French shelter, the Russians set fire to the city, which burned for 5 days. Taking up headquarters in Moscow, Napoleon waited for Alexander I to admit defeat and come to terms. But the Tsar remained intransigent. Napoleon was in a dilemma. To penetrate deeper into Russia was certain death. To stay in Moscow with winter approaching meant possible starvation. Faced with these alternatives, Napoleon was forced to retreat westward to his sources of supply. On October 19, 1812, 95,000 troops and thousands of wagons loaded with loot left Moscow for the long trek back. In early November came the first snow and frost. Army stragglers were slaughtered by Russian Cossacks and peasant partisans. Hungry soldiers pounced on fallen horses, carving them up alive. The wounded were left to lie where they dropped. "Some poor wretched," wrote a French officer,
dragged themselves along, shivering, until the snow packed under the soles of their boots, a bit of debris, a branch, or the body of a fallen comrade tripped them and threw them down. Then their moans for help went unheeded. The snow soon covered them up and only low white mounds showed where they lay. Our road was strewn with these hummocks, like a cemetery.
In the middle of December, with the Russians in pursuit, the remnants of the Grand Army staggered across the Neman River into East Prussia. Napoleon had left his men earlier in the month and, traveling in disguise, reached Paris on December 18.
Napoleon had lost his army. He would soon lose his throne.
Seeing an opportunity in Napoleon's historic defeat, Prussia, Sweden, Austria, and several other German states switched sides, joining Russia, the United Kingdom and others opposing Napoleon. Napoleon vowed that he would create a new army as large as the one he had sent into Russia, and quickly built up his forces in the east from 30,000 to 130,000 and eventually to 400,000. Napoleon inflicted 40,000 casualties on the Allies at Lutzen, the 2nd of May 1813, and Bautzen, the 20th to the 21st of May 1813. Both battles involved forces of over 250,000, making them some of the largest conflicts of the wars so far. Metternich in November 1813 offered Napoleon the Frankfurt Proposals. They would allow Napoleon to remain emperor, but France would be reduced to its natural frontiers, and lose control of most of Italy and Germany and the Netherlands. Napoleon still expected to win the wars, and rejected the terms. By 1814, as the Allies were closing in on Paris, Napoleon did agree to the Frankfurt Proposals, but it was too late and he rejected the new harsher terms proposed by the Allies. Following the end of the armistice, Napoleon seemed to have regained the initiative at Dresden, August 1813, where he once again defeated a numerically superior coalition army and inflicted enormous casualties, while sustaining relatively few. The failures of his marshals and a slow resumption of the offensive on his part cost him any advantage that this victory might have secured. At the Battle of Leipzig in Saxony, the 16th to the 19th of October 1813, also called the Battle of the Nations, 191,000 French fought more than 300,000 Allies, and the defeated French had to retreat into France. After the French withdrawal from Germany, Napoleon's remaining ally, Denmark-Norway, became isolated and fell to the coalition. Allied forces occupied Paris on March 31, 1814. Napoleon abdicated on April 6 in favor of his son, but the Allies insisted on unconditional surrender. Napoleon abdicated again on April 11. Treaty of Fontainebleau exiles Napoleon to Elba with an annual income of 2 million francs. 4. The Royalists took control and restored Louis XVIII to the throne. Only 44 years of age, Napoleon did not believe that it was his destiny to die on Elba. On March 1, 1815, he landed on the French coast with 1,000 soldiers. Louis XVIII ordered his troops to stop Napoleon's advance. When Napoleon's small force approached the king's troops, Napoleon walked up to the soldiers who blocked the road. "If there is one soldier among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." It was a brilliant move by a man who thoroughly understood the French soldier. The king's troops shouted, "Long live the emperor," and joined Napoleon. On March 20, 1815, Napoleon entered Paris to a hero's welcome. He had not lost his charisma. Raising a new army, Napoleon moved against the Allied forces in Belgium. There the British, led by the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians, led by Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher, defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in June 1815. Napoleon's desperate gamble to regain power, the famous 100 Days, had failed.
This time the Allies sent Napoleon to St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic, 1,000 miles off the coast of southern Africa. On this gloomy and rugged rock, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France and would-be conqueror of Europe, spent the last 6 years of his life.
The choice of St. Helena was no coincidence. Unlike Elba, this island was not to be as pleasant a location. In the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from any major landmass, escape was now virtually impossible. It was here that Napoleon was to die in 1821. Napoleon himself contributed to the historical debate. Concerned as ever with his reputation, he reconstructed his career while on St. Helena. His recorded reminiscences are the chief source of the Napoleonic legend. According to this account, Napoleon's principal aim was to defend the revolution and consolidate its gains.
He emerges as a champion of equality and supporter of popular sovereignty who destroyed aristocratic privileges, restored order, and opposed religious intolerance. He appears as a lover of peace forced to take up the sword because of the implacable hatred of Europe's reactionary rulers. According to this reconstruction, Napoleon meant to spread the blessings of the revolution to the Germans, Dutch, Spanish, Poles, and Italians. He wished to create a United States of Europe, a federation of free and enlightened nations living in peace.
Undoubtedly, Napoleon did disseminate many gains of the revolution. Nevertheless, say his critics, this account overlooks much. It ignores the repression of liberty, the subverting of republicanism, the oppression of conquered peoples, and the terrible suffering resulting from his pursuit of glory. The critics see the reminiscences as another example of Napoleonic propaganda. Although the debate over Napoleon continues, historians agree on 2 points. First, his was no ordinary life. A self-made man who harnessed the revolutionary forces of the age and imposed his will on history, Napoleon was right to call his life a romance. His drive, military genius, and charisma propelled him to the peak of power. His inability to moderate his ambition bled Europe, distorted his judgment, and caused his downfall.
His overweening pride, the hubris of the Greek tragedians, would have awed Sophocles. The dimensions of his mind and the intricacies of his personality would have intrigued Shakespeare. His cynicism and utter unscrupulousness would have impressed Machiavelli. His generalship led contemporaries to compare him with Alexander the Great and Hannibal, legendary commanders in the ancient world. Second, historians agree that by spreading revolutionary ideals and institutions, Napoleon made it impossible for the traditional rulers to restore the old regime intact after the emperor's downfall. He had solidified in France what the revolution had initiated, the destruction of a society based on orders and legal privileges and the opening of careers to talent regardless of birth.
In conquered lands, his administrators undermined the authority of aristocrats and clergy. Napoleon's reforms furthered the rationalization and secularization of society and contributed to the transformation of the dynastic state into the modern national state and to the prominence of the bourgeoisie.
The new concept of warfare and the new spirit of nationalism also became an indelible part of the European scene. In the course of succeeding generations, the methods of total warfare in the service of a belligerent nationalism would shatter Napoleon's grandiose vision of a united Europe. They would also subvert the liberal humanism that was the essential heritage of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Adolf Hitler pursed Napoleon's dream to build a united Europe.